My husband once told me, jokingly, "You're safe because you're family now." The joke doesn't feel like a joke anymore. When I first moved to Raven Hollow, I thought I was stepping into a dream. It was a small town tucked between forests so dense they blocked out the sunset in the winter, with streets so narrow that two cars passing each other required careful maneuvering. The kind of town that looked charming in pictures. Cobblestone roads, low stone houses, flower boxes hanging from every window. But there was something about it that didn't quite sit right. Something just beneath the surface. I was 26, freshly married to Jonathan, my college sweetheart, and a lifelong resident of the town. I was a foreigner in more ways than one born and raised in the city, used to the constant motion of traffic, neon lights, and anonymity. Raven Hollow promised the opposite. Quiet, familiarity, community. But as soon as I arrived, I felt an almost imperceptible undercurrent, something that tugged at the back of my mind like a thread I couldn't quite pull. The first night in Jonathan's family home, I thought it was just adjustment. His parents' house was old, made of heavy timber and stone, sprawling in a way that suggested generations had built onto it, one wing at a time. The air smelled of wood polish and something else I couldn't identify, a faint coppery undertone that seemed to linger in corners. "You'll get used to it," Jonathan said, pouring me a cup of tea. His eyes glinted in the dim light, half amused, half serious. "I hope so," I said, smiling. Then he said it, his voice light, almost joking, though I couldn't tell if it was completely a joke. "You're safe now," he said, "because you're family." I laughed. "Safe from what?" He shrugged. "You'll see, it's a family thing. Nothing to worry about." At the time I took it at face value. Newly married, trusting, slightly naive. But the words didn't leave my mind, even as I unpacked my suitcase in the guest room. Safe. Family. What did he mean by that? The town settled into its quiet rhythm quickly. Streets emptied by 9 p.m. Lights in homes flickered on and off in perfect sequence. And the neighbors, everyone seemed to know each other, would nod or wave as I passed. But there was always a pause in their smiles when I tried to make small talk, a brief flicker in their eyes, as if they were deciding how much I was allowed to know. I tried not to notice it. Inside the house, life seemed ordinary enough. Clarissa, Jonathan's mother, was polite, reserved, and always observing. I couldn't tell if she liked me, or was simply studying me. His father rarely spoke, towering in his silence, and his siblings were courteous, but distant. They moved through the house like shadows, quick, precise, almost rehearsed in their actions. But there were things that unsettled me, small things I couldn't explain. The first time I saw the basement, for instance, I went down there to find a storage space for my suitcases and old boxes. It was larger than the house appeared from the outside, low-ceilinged and dimly lit, lined with shelves of canned goods and old tools. At the far end, tucked away behind a stack of crates, was a massive freezer. Not a household freezer, the kind you'd find in a restaurant or a butcher shop. Industrial, humming faintly, cold air leaking from the edges of the door. Jonathan appeared behind me. "That's off limits," he said casually, as if it were just a detail I shouldn't question. "Family things only." "Family things?" I asked, a little too loudly, trying to keep the nervousness from my voice. He smiled, that same glint in his eyes. "Just some things you don't need to worry about yet. You'll understand when the time comes." The way he said it made me pause. Something about the calmness of his tone made the freezer feel heavier, like it wasn't just metal and cold air, it carried a presence. Life in Raven Hollow had its quirks too. Foreigners didn't seem to stay long. I would hear whispers at the market, small murmurs of tourists or visitors who had arrived, and then quietly disappeared. Nobody ever seemed concerned, only polite, measured in their responses if I asked. "New girl from the city?" one elderly woman said, her smile tight. "You'll get used to it. Life here, it takes care of itself." I laughed nervously and kept walking. It was the town's rhythm that unnerved me most. People came and went according to invisible rules I couldn't see. Trucks would arrive at odd hours, and by morning, they'd be gone. Strangers passed through, and then they didn't. It wasn't the lack of news coverage that worried me. It was the absence of questions, of concern. Everything was neat, orderly, and silent. Too orderly. Jonathan, meanwhile, became more insistent that I understand my place in the household. "Since you're family now," he said one night as we walked past the basement door, "it's okay to be curious. Just don't go too far." I wanted to press him, ask him what that meant. But there was something in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes darted toward the freezer and back, that made me hesitate. The basement became a magnet. I found myself descending the stairs late at night, drawn by a strange mix of curiosity and unease. I would wander past the shelves, past the old tools, and stop in front of the freezer, listening to the hum of the machinery. Sometimes, I thought I heard noises coming from inside, clicks, thuds, almost like someone moving around. But when I asked Jonathan, he only smiled and said I was imagining things. Other times I would notice things that didn't make sense. A truck leaving without anything that should have been inside it. A neighbor suddenly leaving town, only to reappear weeks later, as if nothing had happened. Shadows moving behind curtains when there shouldn't have been anyone there. And always, always, the pervasive sense that I was being watched, measured, weighed. It was on a Friday night, when the town's small square was filled with lights and music, that I first felt the real weight of the words Jonathan had said. "You're safe because you're family now," he whispered as we walked past a cluster of townspeople. The laughter around us was warm, but their eyes lingered on me just a second too long. A flicker of something in their faces that made me look away. "Safe from what?" I asked, my voice almost lost in the music and chatter. He didn't answer, just squeezed my hand. "Just from everything else." I should have pressed him, but I didn't. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was just a joke, a harmless statement meant to comfort me. But the feeling lingered long after. Even in the house, I began noticing other things. The knives in the kitchen were sharper than necessary. The pantry was filled with jars and containers, all meticulously labeled. But there were some things, metal trays, covered dishes, sealed containers that were never opened in my presence. The freezer's hum grew louder at night, or maybe I just became more aware of it. Every time I passed by it, I felt a shiver. I couldn't explain. And yet, no one ever forbade me from being curious. They just guided me, subtly, carefully. Jonathan's hand on my back, Clarissa's quiet presence in the kitchen. The way the younger siblings would smile politely, but not linger when I asked questions. Everything in Ravenhollow felt layered, like there were rules I couldn't see, boundaries I didn't yet understand, and I kept thinking about that phrase, "You're safe now, because you're family." I didn't know what it meant, but I could feel it, and it was growing heavier by the day. I started keeping mental notes instead of written ones. That wasn't a conscious decision at first, it just happened. Something about Ravenhollow made me wary of leaving traces. Notes felt too permanent, too easy to find. So I memorized patterns instead. Who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, which houses had lights on late, which didn't. Jonathan noticed the change before I did. "You're quieter," he said one evening, not accusatory, just observant. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. His mother had already cleared the plates with her usual efficiency, stacking them carefully, rinsing them immediately. Putting ever sat out in that house. Nothing lingered. "Just hired," I said. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "It takes time to adjust." "Ravenhollow isn't like where you're from." "No," I agreed. "It's not." That was the truth, but not the whole truth. I began to notice how often people used the word family here, not just to mean relatives, to mean belonging. At the bakery, the owner slipped an extra loaf into Jonathan's bag and said, "For family." At the hardware store, an entire shelf was closed to me until Jonathan stepped closer, and the clerk's demeanor shifted instantly. "Oh," he said, smiling, "didn't realize." "Go ahead." I asked Jonathan about it later. "It's just how things work here," he said. "People look out for their own, and I count as your own?" He smiled at that. "Of course you do." I wanted to feel reassured. Instead, I felt categorized. There were rules in Ravenhollow. Unspoken ones. People didn't wander at night. They didn't ask about newcomers after the first few days. They didn't pry when a house went dark for a week or two. They didn't discuss the past beyond a certain point. And they definitely didn't talk about people who left. I noticed this after asking an innocent question at the weekly market. A woman had been selling handmade soaps the previous week, a foreign accent, friendly smile, bright scarves. This week, her stall was gone. "Did she move?" I asked the fruit vendor. He paused, just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to notice. "She wasn't from here," he said carefully. "Oh," I replied. "Do you know where she went?" Another pause. "She found somewhere else," he said. "Ravenhollow isn't for everyone." When Jonathan joined me a moment later, the vendor's entire posture changed. He relaxed, smiled broadly, handed over an extra bag of apples. "For family," he said again. The words felt heavier every time I heard them. The freezer became impossible to ignore. Not because anyone talked about it, but because everyone behaved as if it were normal. Clarissa checked it morning and night, clipboard in hand, sometimes writing something down, sometimes just standing there with the door open for a few seconds longer than necessary. Once, I asked her what she was keeping track of. "Dates," she said simply. "Dates of?" "Use," she replied, already turning away. I noticed then that everything related to the freezer was labeled the same way: packages, containers, even shelves, dates, no descriptions, no categories, just numbers and months. At first, I told myself it was practical. Rural town, bulk storage, maybe hunting culture, maybe farming. But I'd grown up around hunters. They labeled their meat. They always did. Jonathan's siblings were polite, but distant, like coworkers instead of family. They spoke in half sentences, exchanged looks that felt like punctuation I couldn't read. One evening, I overheard them talking in the hallway. "Not yet," one said quietly. "She's adjusting," another replied. "Still new." I stepped back into the bedroom before they could see me. Later that night, Jonathan wrapped an arm around me in bed, his voice soft. "You're doing fine," he said. "Doing fine at what?" I asked. He kissed my forehead. At being here. Something else started bothering me. The way people looked at me, not unfriendly, not predatory, assessing. At gatherings, conversations would subtly shift when I joined. Not stop, just redirect. People asked me where I was from, how long I planned to stay, whether I liked the food. They always asked about the food. You eat well? Getting enough? Found your favorites yet? When I answered yes, they smiled. When I hesitated, they smiled wider. At one dinner, an older man clinked his glass and said, laughing, "She's filling out nicely." The table laughed with him. Jonathan squeezed my knee under the table. A warning or reassurance, I couldn't tell which. The town had a way of closing ranks. I noticed it when a young man came through, clearly not local. Backpack, city clothes, polite but slightly lost. He stayed at the inn for 2 nights. I saw him once, sitting alone on a bench near the river. On the 3rd day, his room was empty. I asked the innkeeper if he'd checked out early. Yes, she said smoothly. Decided to move on. But he didn't. Jonathan cleared his throat behind me. Thanks, he said, smiling at the innkeeper. We were just curious. As we walked away, I lowered my voice. He left without his bag. Jonathan didn't slow down. You're noticing too much. That night, I dreamed of doors locking one by one. There were other things too. Small, unsettling details that piled up quietly. The butcher shop never displayed whole cuts. Everything was pre-wrapped, pre-portioned. The church sermons spoke often about unity and sacrifice, but never about forgiveness. The town council meetings were closed to non-residents, but Jonathan now insisted I counted. Your family, he reminded me. At home, Clarissa began involving me more in household routines. Not the freezer, but the steps around it. Cleaning schedules, inventory days, timing. Precision matters, she said once, handing me a list that didn't explain itself. Just dates and check marks. What happens if something's late? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. We don't let that happen. I tried to ground myself in logic. Small towns are weird, traditions get entrenched. Outsiders exaggerate. Fear fills in gaps when information is missing. But logic faltered when I noticed how carefully I was being handled. Jonathan didn't forbid me from leaving town, but he always had a reason to come with me. He didn't tell me not to talk to people. But conversations always seemed to end when he arrived. He didn't say, don't ask questions, but every answer felt deliberately incomplete. One night, I finally asked him outright, Am I actually safe? I said. He looked surprised. Of course. Safe from what? I pressed. He hesitated. Just a second. From being alone, he said finally. From not belonging. I wanted to believe that was all he meant. The phrase echoed everywhere now. Safe. Family. Belongin'. They were spoken like blessings, or like rules. I caught my reflection in the mirror one evening and barely recognized the person staring back. I dressed differently now. Spoke less. Smiled on cue. I was adapting. That realization scared me more than anything else. Because whatever Ravenhollow was, it wasn't trying to scare me away. It was trying to keep me. And every time someone said, you're safe because you're family now, it felt less like comfort and more like a condition. I stopped dreaming in color. That was the first thing I noticed, though it took me a while to name it. My dreams used to be vivid, crowded city streets, flashing signs, strangers brushing past me. Now, they were muted. Browns, grays, dim yellows, interiors, corridors, rooms without windows. I would wake up before dawn with the sense that something had been decided while I slept. Jonathan slept deeply beside me every night, one arm heavy across my waist as if anchoring me in place. Sometimes I lay still, listening to his breathing, wondering if he dreamed in color too, or if Ravenhollow had drained that from him long ago. The first real escalation came disguised as kindness. Clarissa began asking me to help more around the house. Not chores exactly. Coordination, lists, timing. She would hand me slips of paper with dates written on them and ask me to remind her when certain things were due. Due for what? I asked once. She smiled. You don't need to worry about that yet. That word again. Yet. I noticed that the dates weren't random. They lined up with town events, market days, church gatherings, deliveries that arrived late at night and were gone by morning. When I pointed this out, Clarissa's eyes sharpened, not angrily, but with interest. You're observant, she said. That's good. Good for what? She didn't say. The town itself began to feel smaller. Not physically, but socially, fewer unfamiliar faces, fewer passers-by. The inn was almost always empty now, its windows dark even during what should have been peak season. When I asked Jonathan if tourism had slowed, he shrugged. It comes in waves, he said. Some years are quieter, but I don't see anyone new at all. He smiled faintly. That's because you know everyone now. That wasn't true. But it felt like it could become true if I stayed long enough. I started noticing the way people watched the roads, not openly, casually, from porches, from shop windows, from behind fences. Cars that didn't belong slowed as they passed through town, drivers scanning for gas stations, diners, signs of life. They rarely stopped. Those that did were noticed immediately. One afternoon, a dusty sedan pulled into the single gas station on the edge of Raven Hollow. I was inside buying milk when the bell above the door rang. The man looked lost, mid-30s maybe. Accent unfamiliar. "Is there a motel nearby?" he asked. The cashier hesitated. "Just a beat. The inn," she said finally. "If you're staying." Her eyes flicked to me. I felt it then. A subtle shift in the room. Attention narrowing. The man thanked her and left. Through the window, I saw two locals step outside their shops, phones already in hand. Not calling, texting. When Jonathan picked me up later, I mentioned it casually. "Oh," he said, "Thanks. That guy." "What about him?" "He won't be here long." The way he said it wasn't threatening, it was factual. Like talking about weather. That night, I couldn't sleep. The freezer hummed louder than usual, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until curiosity, or dread, pushed me out of bed. I went down to the basement quietly, barefoot on cold stone. The freezer was open. Just a crack. Cold air spilled out, fogging slightly in the dim light. Clarissa wasn't there. No clipboard. No voices. I stood frozen, heart pounding, staring at the gap. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Inside, I could see stacks of meat, neat, deliberate. Packages wrapped in plastic and paper, all identical. All labeled with dates in thick black marker. Some dates were recent. Some were years old. I noticed something new then. A few packages had been crossed out. Not removed. Crossed out. A shiver ran through me. I closed the freezer gently and backed away. At the top of the stairs, Jonathan was waiting. "You shouldn't be down here alone," he said quietly. I swallowed. It was open. "Yes," he said. It was. That was all. After that, the town began including me more. Invitations came more frequently. Dinners, planning meetings, church committees. Always framed as support, as inclusion. "You're one of us now," they said. I noticed how language shifted around me. Fewer euphemisms. Less careful phrasing. Not explanations, but assumptions. At one gathering, someone joked about waste. "We don't waste here," an older woman said firmly. "Not like the cities do." Everyone nodded. I nodded too, my throat tight. Jonathan's affection intensified. He checked on me constantly, asked where I was going, who I'd spoken to. It was easy to mistake it for concern. "You don't feel lonely, do you?" he asked one evening. "No," I said automatically. "Good," he replied. "Because loneliness makes people leave." The word leave hung between us. I realized then that no one ever talked about leaving Raven Hollow. Not as a plan, not as a possibility, just as something that happened to other people. I tried to reach out beyond the town. My phone signal was unreliable, spotty at best. Internet crawled, calls dropped. One night, I managed to get a message through to an old friend from the city. Just a casual check-in. Her reply came hours later. "Are you okay? You sound different." I stared at the words longer than I should have. Before I could respond, the signal vanished. The next morning, Jonathan mentioned offhandedly that the town council was discussing infrastructure improvements. "For connectivity," he said, "so people don't feel cut off." The timing made my skin crawl. The man from the gas station never checked into the inn. The next day, his car was parked behind the municipal building, already dusty, like it had been there for weeks. No one mentioned him. When I asked the innkeeper if she'd seen him, she looked confused. "Seen who?" "The man who came yesterday. For a room." She frowned slightly. "No one knew's been here in days." I let it go. I was learning when silence was safer. Clarissa finally let me help with the freezer inventory. Not inside, never inside, but the records. She spread the sheets across the kitchen table, rows of dates, check marks, crossouts. "This is important work," she said. "It keeps everything running smoothly." "What happens if it doesn't?" I asked. She met my gaze calmly. "Then people notice." That night, I dreamed of being sealed inside something cold and dark, dates written across the walls. The town festival arrived sooner than I expected, lights strung across the square, long tables, food everywhere. More than usual. I noticed how carefully the portions were controlled, how nothing was left over, how plates were cleared quickly, discreetly. A man raised a toast. "To family," he said. Everyone echoed it. Jonathan leaned close to my ear. "This is when newcomers usually decide if they belong." My heart raced. "Newcomers?" He smiled. "You did." I looked around the square, at the familiar faces, the practiced warmth, and for the first time, I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't said yes. Late that night, after the festival ended and the square emptied, I heard a knock at the door. Jonathan answered it before I could move. Two men stood outside, both locals, both serious. "Everything okay?" Jonathan asked. They nodded. "Just confirming numbers," one said. Jonathan glanced back at me. A look passed between them, too quick to decode. "All good here," Jonathan replied. They left. I stood in the doorway, shaking. Confirming numbers for what? He took my hands gently. "You ask a lot of questions. I need answers." He looked at me for a long moment. "You're safe," he said finally. "Because you're family now." This time, there was no humor in it at all. I write this now because I need to keep my thoughts straight. Because something is changing. Because I don't know how much longer I can pretend not to see the pattern. Raven Hollow doesn't chase people, it absorbs them. And the closer I get to understanding how, the more I realize something terrifying. They aren't hiding anything from me anymore. They're waiting. I knew, finally, that something in Raven Hollow had been wrong from the very start. But it wasn't until the night I was cleaning the kitchen alone that the realization hit me in a way that would never leave. I was washing dishes, the faint hum of the refrigerator and freezer behind me. The house was silent. Jonathan had gone to the town council meeting, another one of those gatherings I was still trying to make sense of. The others were out running errands or visiting neighbors. I thought I was alone. I wasn't. The smell hit me first. Not the faint coppery undertone I'd noticed in the basement before. This was sharper, iron-rich, bitter, wrong. My hand froze mid-wash. I wiped the soap suds from my fingers and sniffed the air. Nothing. Just the hum, the smell dissipating like a trick of my imagination. But my gut twisted. Something was off. I walked to the pantry, glancing at the stacked containers and jars. Everything neat, everything labeled. And then I noticed it, a small brown paper bag, tucked behind the canned beans. Dated, as always. Jonathan's handwriting on the top. 05-17. I hesitated. I shouldn't have done it. Curiosity, a foolish, dangerous curiosity, tugged me forward. I picked it up. Light. Nothing. Not heavy enough to feel like meat should be, not exactly. But my stomach churned anyway. I tore the bag open. Inside, nothing I could identify immediately. Just pieces of jewelry, dirty and soiled, stained brown. My hands touched something slick, sheet-like beneath the rings, and I gagged, dropping it. It was a piece of someone's skin, peeled meticulously. At that moment, I heard it. The voice of the town ringing softly through the kitchen doorway. Everything okay, dear? Jonathan, calm, warm, protective, but something in the timbre. Something. In his eyes, when he stepped into the light, made my stomach turn. I found this, I stammered. What is this? Why do we have something like this at our house? He glanced at the bag, eyes flicking ever so slightly. Ah, he said. You shouldn't touch that. Why? I demanded. Jonathan, I need to know. He sighed, rubbing his forehead, as if he were explaining something simple to a child. You've been wondering about the town, haven't you? He asked. I froze. I've been noticing things, I said carefully. People disappearing. The way everyone talks about family. The dates on the freezer packages. The deliveries at night. Everything. I know there's something you're not telling me. He leaned closer, hands on the counter, eyes calm, but unwavering. And now, he said softly, you're starting to understand. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but my voice caught in my throat. Something deep and ancient within me screamed, and I realized it wasn't fear alone. It was recognition, like pieces of a puzzle I'd refused to see sliding into place. Then I smelled it again, that metallic, bitter smell. Stronger this time. Not from the bag, from the freezer. And I noticed the faint stains along the corners of the freezer door. Not obvious. Not blood red, but darker than any frozen meat I had seen. I backed away, hands trembling. Jonathan, tell me, this isn't. Listen, he said, quieter now. I wish I could have told you differently, but there's no other way to explain it. Raven Hollow survives the way it always has. Family keeps family alive. Outsiders, well, they maintain our food chain. In one way or the other. The words sank in slowly, like ice melting in my veins. No, I whispered. No, this isn't food. Not. Yes, he said, it's all been people. Outsiders. They come here, unaware, and they become part of the system. More they vanish. But you're different. You're family now. That's why you're safe. The room tilted. My chest tightened. I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the counter, staring at him. My husband. My protector. The person I trusted. You've eaten it? I croaked. You. He looked away, then back at me. Yes. The meals you've had here. You've been eating what everyone else ate. And everyone eats the same way. I gagged, the bile rising. Memories of dinners flooded my mind. The perfectly roasted meat, the rich sauces, the delicate seasoning. Never questioning, always hungry, always grateful. And now, impossible to stomach the realization. Every bite had been part of the system. Part of something monstrous I had failed to see. I stumbled to the sink, gripping it for support. He stepped closer, cautiously, carefully, like he might somehow soothe me. You're not in danger, he'd said again. Not anymore. You're safe. Safe? I laughed bitterly, a sound that barely escaped my throat. You call this safe? It's the only way the town works, he said softly. And it's been the only way for generations. Outsiders don't last here. They always leave, one way or another. But you belong. You're part of the family. You don't have to worry. I stared at him, at the calm, unflinching face of my husband, my friend, the man I had trusted with my life. And I realized the joke he'd made months ago wasn't a joke. It had never been a joke. You're part of this? I whispered. Yes, he said, I've always been, and now so are you. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but the words stuck in my throat. Raven Hollow had no real exits for outsiders. Every road was watched, every street accounted for. I was trapped, and I had been eating them. I stumbled to the table and sat, burying my face in my hands. The taste, the smell, the meals, it all came back to me, vivid, horrifying. The dinners with the family, the town gatherings, the festival platters. Every carefully cooked, perfectly seasoned dish had been what he said it was. Jonathan knelt beside me, his hand gentle on my shoulder. I know, he said. It's a lot. But you survived. You're part of us now. Your family. I shook my head, tears spilling. I can't eat anything anymore. You'll learn to digest it, he said. Even love the taste of it if you give it a chance. But his calmness made me shiver. That serene acceptance. The way he spoke as if this were normal terrified me more than any scream, any chase, any threat ever could. I looked around the kitchen. The lights seemed too bright now, artificial in a way they hadn't been before. Shadows clung to corners, stretched across the floors. The hum of the freezer grew louder, almost a heartbeat. I wanted to leave, to run to the roads I had seen countless times. But even as I thought it, I knew the roads led nowhere. Every turn, every path, funneled you back to Raven Hollow. Only the locals truly knew the way out of this maze. Only the locals were allowed to leave. With the certainty that they would always return, they always did. I wanted answers, I wanted to escape. I wanted to call someone, but I knew, deep down, there were no outsiders left to call. Not anymore. Jonathan stood, brushing off his hands. I should let you rest, he said. There's time to adjust. You'll understand more tomorrow. I nodded numbly, not trusting myself to speak. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. The whispers of the town's soft conversations drifting through walls. Laughter echoing from places I couldn't see. Felt different now. Calculated. Watching. Waiting. I realized then it wasn't just Jonathan, it was everyone. Every smiling neighbor, every polite shopkeeper, every church member. They were all part of it. They had always been part of it. And they all knew the truth. And I had eaten with them, laughed with them, trusted them. Safe, family. I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me, suffocating, yet binding. I had survived the first step. I had been welcomed. I had been assimilated. But the realization, the horrifying, unbearable truth, was only the beginning. I was part of them now. And Raven Hollow was watching. I waited until a few days, learned to read the systematic patterns the town survived from. And when the town's entire population had gathered in the square for the weekly fiesta ritual I had silently observed since my arrival. The tables were long, stacked with platters and covered dishes. Everyone laughed, everyone shared stories, and everyone assumed I would eat alongside them, as I had countless times before. I smiled politely as I helped carry a large pot of stew toward the main table. It was innocuous-looking, rich and aromatic, the kind of food that made people drop their guards. I had spent days testing it, calibrating the doses, making sure it would incapacitate them without immediate death. A slow, careful spread. I stirred it one last time before adding the final ingredient, the poison I had acquired months earlier under the guise of medicinal herbs. A powder so bitter it was tasteless once dissolved in a large enough volume. One small pot for one town, enough to make them sick, but not instantly kill them. Not yet. I distributed the stew. People ladled it onto their plates with familiar smiles, never suspecting a thing. Even Jonathan took a generous portion, nodding at me with his usual warmth. Here you go, I said, my voice calm, almost casual. It's a special recipe. I thought you'd like it. He smiled. Thank you, love. Always thinking of everyone. The first effects were subtle. A cough here, a slight flush there. By the time the majority of the plates were empty, the entire square was quieting in confusion. Then, the vomiting began. A few coughed, some stumbled back from the tables, clutching their stomachs, others doubled over on the benches. Panic spread quickly. People shouted, ran in different directions, stumbling, collapsing. They were afraid, terrified, but alive barely. I took a step back, pretending to clutch my own stomach in mock sympathy, though I felt nothing. I watched them writhe, realizing the truth. This was my first real leverage. I approached Jonathan carefully. Even he was weakened, pale, sweat running down his temples. He glared at me, sick but still composed enough to argue. You did this? He demanded, his voice hoarse. Yes, I said, steady and calm, but you'll live. We both will. If you help me. His eyes narrowed, suspicion and fury mixing in dangerous ways. What do you want? He asked. Drive me to the city, I said, keeping my tone even. Let me go, unharmed, that's the condition. And you'll have your antidote. He hesitated, the sickness making his decision slower. the crowd outside now screaming and doubling over, throwing up in unison. He knew my plan worked. He knew I had control. Begrudgingly, he nodded, gripping the wheel as we left the town behind. By the time we reached the city limits, Jonathan was barely holding himself upright, leaning weakly on the steering wheel. My heart pounded, but not in fear. This was it. I had survived, and the control was finally mine. I instructed him to stop at a friend's house, a safe place I had prepared in advance. My friend's father was ex-military, and they had a secure, secluded property. I knew once I reached it, I would be untouchable. Jonathan stumbled from the car, still pale and weak. I gave him the vial, the antidote I had promised, and watched him consume it, believing it would heal them from the poison. He turned to me, hopeful and desperate. "Family? Safe," he croaked. "Safe," I repeated. "For you, only if you follow instructions." I made him return to the town carrying additional portions of the antidote, which the townspeople consumed willingly, thinking they were being cured. It wasn't an antidote at all. It was a catalyst, a quick-acting dose that would finish what the initial poison had started. Within hours, the streets of Ravenhollow became eerily silent. I stayed hidden in the city that night, my friend sheltering me, her father keeping watch. I slept fitfully, heart still racing, knowing the town I had once called home. The town that had made me eat with them, laugh with them, trust them, would never be the same again. The next morning, I tipped a journalist anonymously. I spun a story. Ravenhollow reports a mysterious outbreak. Locals vanish. Authorities investigating. I made it sound vague enough to seem credible, but alarming enough to draw immediate attention. By midday, the journalists arrived. They drove into the empty streets, cameras rolling, notebooks out, recording the silence, and then they found the bodies. Every single townsfolk was dead. Some slumped at tables, some on benches, some in their homes. The cause of death could not be immediately determined, but it was clear that it was sudden and thorough. And in the central house, the freezer remained open, full, and horrifyingly labeled. Each package marked with a date, the day each visitor had been consumed. Journalists gasped at the sheer organization of it. The story broke immediately. The headline screamed, "Ravenhollow, entire town found dead, freezer full of human flesh." Investigators could not determine the exact cause of death, but speculated it was the long-term consumption of human flesh. No one truly cared enough for these flesh-eating townspeople to actually search for the cause of their death. Their focus remained on the true victims. Victim names, previously listed as missing in the national papers, were cross-referenced with the freezer's records, confirming the horrifying reality. Outsiders had been consumed systematically for decades. By the afternoon, the story had gone viral. News stations covered it across the country. Experts speculated on the psychology, the biology, the centuries-old traditions that had led to such a monstrous system. And through it all, I remained safe in my friend's house, finally free, finally able to breathe. Thanks to my friend's father, I was able to create a new identity for myself in a completely new country, away from all the evidence that legally tied me to Jonathan as his wife. I am not yet sure whether I should be grateful for ever meeting Jonathan, who led me to the most regrettable discovery of my life. His death, however, was the least regrettable for me. I had taken control. I had turned their system against them. Justice, crude and terrifying as it was, had been served, and Ravenhollow, the town that had tried to trap me, had been undone entirely by the very system it had built to protect itself.